we got together once a week to do 5 shows, make a few bucks, and have a lot of laughs. And that's what we did. I was in show business for 25 years before I ever got into Hollywood Squares. And this is my 65th year in show business. So Hollywood Squares was 40 years ago, and it was an accident, just a silly thing that happened. In those days, I had been on Broadway with Julie Harris in a show called Skyscraper, the only musical she ever did, Charles Nelson Riley, who, I just say his name, I laugh. We starred for about a year and a half, and I came out to California, and I got a call from a fellow by the name of Bob Quigley. And he said, would you like to do a game show? And I said, what's a game show? I didn't know anything about game shows. To be frank with you, I was not an aficionado. And so I went to his office, and they showed me this pilot they had done with Bert Parks at CBS a year ago. And I said, that's a very clever show. And I said, why aren't you using Bert Parks? And he said, well, we're looking for a complete nonentity. I had been in the business 25. I was known in the business, but he was right. You know, I couldn't sell tickets. I did a lot of theater. I started in London with Cheetah Rivera and Bye Bye Birdie. And I got second billing, of course. And I started with Jane Powell. I started with Dennis Day. I did plays everywhere. But I didn't sell the tickets. I was the leading man, and or the comedy relief, whatever. So he was right. And if nothing else, Squares made me an entity of sorts. So after 16 years of Squares, at least they knew who the heck I was, for the most part. I started out as a band singer at 15. I got my first job singing with a band out of Detroit by the name of Bob Chester. I'd been a page boy at NBC. The first game show I ever saw, I paged. Now you got to remember, NBC in those days was not television, it was all radio. I roomed with a guy by the name of Bill Breitbard. He changed his name to William B. Williams, and on WNEW in New York, he was the #1 guy. He's the one that named Sinatra, gave him the title Chairman of the Board. And Billy and I were roommates. And I was the youngest page in the history of NBC. And I paged the Fred Waring show at the Vanderbilt Theater. I paged Truth or Consequences with Ralph Edwards. And that's the first game show I ever saw, was Truth or Consequences. Well, Tommy Noonan was just a really clever comic. Tommy passed away in 1968. And he starred with Marilyn Monroe in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. He played Gus, and he was in the Judy Garland movie, what the heck, I can't think of the night is younger, anyway, I'll think of it in just a second. But before that, he had been under contract to RKO, and he was a clever comic. He was out of work, and his brother was then going with my sister. His brother was John Ireland, and my sister was Joanne Drew. And so we decided to put an act together. I owed $67 to a dentist. And I figured, well, let's put a comedy act together and we'll pay off a few bills. We couldn't afford writers, so we wrote our own stuff. We opened it to Billy Gray's Bandbox, which at that time was quite a... Polly Bergen got us the job, by the way. She was the opening act, and she had seen us work, and she got us this gig at Billy Gray's, and we stayed there for 16 weeks. We were out of work for years. We worked for 1 solid year in LA alone, and went to New York at the Martinique, and we became, next to Dean and Jerry, we were Noonan and Marshall. We were the comedy team. We did the Sullivan Show many, many times. My favorite show was, well, there were so many shows in those days, but Freddie, you got to help me out for just a second. Who's the guy that was, Gary Moore. My favorite show to do was Gary Moore. And they treated you wonderfully. Durwood Kirby and Marion Lorne, and we'd be out of town, and they'd say, you're going to be on the show in 2 weeks. Do you need any sets? What do you need? Do you need costumes? Do you need props? The Sullivan Show, you'd go on, they would, you know, they didn't care about you. Now you see, monologists used to work wonderfully on the Sullivan Show because they would come out and do 7, 8, 10 minutes. As you're going on, they'd say, cut 4 minutes. Well, they'd cut 4 minutes. We did sketches. So Marlowe Lewis was the guy's name who ran the show and produced the show. So as we would walk out, he'd say, cut 4 minutes. We can't cut 4 minutes, it's a sketch, you know. So we'd hurry everything. We never came off well on the Sullivan Show. But the Gary Moore Show, I wish I had those tapes. I have all the old Sullivan shows, and we were all right. But the Gary Moore shows, we were terrific. He was all right. You know, he was, I didn't really know him that well. I'd seen him at Danny's Hideaway, which was the hangout in New York in those days. And he was always very gentlemanly to me, very, very polite. And, but, you know, he wasn't really a performer. He was a newspaper guy. And he was all right. Gary Moore, on the other hand, was a darling man. He was wonderful. You know, he was just the best. I learned how to read cue cards from Gary Moore. Now, on squares, I would have 3 cue cards. I would have a card here, a card there, and a card here. And I could read cards like I'm just ad-libbing everything. And I learned that from Gary Moore because that's what he did. And I used to do the show, when he had a daytime show, he used to be a strip show like 5 days a week. And we were regulars on that show. The big show, I'm talking, he also had an hour show once a week. But I watched him read cue cards. And he was a genius, and that's how I'm really good at cue cards. I wish we had some cue cards. That would really be good on the show. I still am a singer. How about them apples? I work all the time. That's what they call me, the boy singer. I have a CD out called Boy Singer. I have another CD called No Happy Endings, all new, and they've done wonderfully well. I do a lot of concerts, and people are coming around again. And I have to thank people who I'm not particularly fond of their music. I mean, Rod Stewart is not a very good singer, but I love him because he's introduced all these great songs to the young people, as Steve Tyrell. There's some really good singers. Michael Bublé is a lovely singer, and Steve Lawrence is still singing great. Jack Jones is still singing great. There's still a lot of great singers, but Rod Stewart, whether you like him or not, has really helped my kind of music. He's introduced all this wonderful music to the young people. 15, I started out as a band singer, and I consider myself not an actor, not a game show host. If somebody said, what do you do for a living? I said, well, I sing. I'm a singer. That's what I do. It was perfect. I mean, I'd been on my feet performing, either as part of a comedy team or as a singer. I'd been on stage in New York and in London, and I did more book shows in Vegas than anything. I did High Button Shoes, Anything Goes, Panama Hattie, Bye Bye Birdie, All About Sin in Vegas. So I knew how to take a stage. And I think not being a game show host, I wasn't very game show hosty, you know. When they asked me to do the show, I started watching game shows. And I said, why is this guy not too good? Why is this guy good? But there was one guy who was good at everything he ever did. And you know why? Because he was very natural. He was very polite. He loved his contestants and the other people. And his name was Bill Cullen. And I watched Bill Cullen. Now, I could not emulate Bill Cullen. No one could. But I figured, well, I think I'll go out and have some fun. I'll learn the game. I'll enjoy my contestants. I'll enjoy my stars. And my background was, you know, I had a big background before I went to Squares, so I was comfortable. It was a comedy show, but it was also a game show. It was a game show. And if you didn't play the game, that's what all the recreations of Squares, why it didn't work. They all went for comedy. They didn't go for a game. You basically have to have a game. And if you can get some comedy out of that game, well, that's great. And that's what the original Squares. People say, you know, you made Squares. I didn't make Squares. The questions, the pace of the show, Paul Lynde, Charlie Weaver, Wally Cox, Rosemarie, those are the people that made Squares. I was just there laughing, asking questions, and just having a good time. It was a very familial show. We all really adored each other. We really did. And I think that's why the other shows never seemed to work. They weren't family. We were family. I would have to watch myself because there were so many openings for jokes and things. And I said, no, Pete. You're the straight man. Just stay right where you are. Once in a while, I couldn't help myself, and I would just let loose with some. But it was their show. I was there to try to make them look as good as possible. Oh, I couldn't do that game. I wouldn't be good at Jeopardy. I really wouldn't. I've done Wheel of Fortune. I was pretty good at that. They'll ask me at a casino, like I did a week. I have a story. They asked, would you do Wheel of Fortune in Minneapolis at a gambling place? I said, sure, if the money's right, I'll do anything, That's what we do for a living. We try to have some fun and make a few bucks. So I said, okay, that can't be a hard game to learn, which it isn't. And I said, now who in their right mind would come and see Wheel of Fortune and pay 20 bucks or whatever it is? Well, I check in, and now it's 5 days. 2 shows, I think about 7 shows. Now, you got to remember, there are only like 2 or 3 contestants, and there's 1,600 people. Who's going to pay 20? I go, and it said, Wheel of Fortune sold out. I said, sold out? And the people loved it. They loved watching that show. And I've always thought that show was done incorrectly. Yeah. You spin the wheel, and you go L. There's no L. Now you got to spin the wheel again. You go, P. There's no P. You spin the wheel again. You watch the doggone wheel go around. N. There's no N. Why don't you go N? No N. P? No P. W? Spin the wheel. Okay? You would expedite matter. That show would go bang, 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 but it probably wouldn't work. Merv Griffin is really smart. He knew how to make it work. The show to me would have gone bang, bang, bang. It probably wouldn't have worked. So what do I know? I'm just a lowly host. That was sort of the precursor to the Hollywood Squares. It was produced by the same people, by the way, Peter Quigley. No, I never saw the game. I just knew that he had done the game Celebrity Show, or Celebrity Game, whatever it was. And I can't even comment on it. I never saw the show. As I told you, I was not a fan of game shows. I did like Password. I loved Password. And I would see that occasionally, but that was about it. Now, when I got into the game show business, I loved certain games. I loved Tom Kennedy's show, You Don't Say. I thought that was really wonderfully done. And like Monty's Let's Make a Deal, I would have been lousy on that too. Monty would have been, he's perfect. It's amazing how certain people had perfect shows. Monty was perfect. Bob Barker's perfect for it, although Bill Cullen was terrific on The Price is Right. But Bill Cullen could have done Squares too. Yeah, Bill Cullen, he could have done anything, But it's amazing. I don't know if I'd have been good on a non-celebrity show. Maybe. I was pretty good on Wheel, I think, when I did it in Minneapolis. Actually, Merrill Heater takes credit for this, although I think I have a part of it too. When I started doing Squares, I would watch it. And I don't enjoy watching myself. And I would say, why is that show good? Why was that show good? Why was that show not as good? And then one day I started counting questions. And the shows where the questions were, I don't know, 14, 15, 24 questions, 26 questions. See, we're back to the game again. Not laughs, the game. Once we did 24, 25, 26 questions, the show went bang, 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 even without laughs. So Merrill said that he figured that one out, and maybe he did, because I respect him so much. He's the one that created the game. But I can remember suggesting, why don't we do more questions? In fact, King World came to me and wanted me to go on a tour to find a host for the new Hollywood Squares. And I said, no, I don't want to do that. I said, I tell you what you do, hire Jay Reddick and Bill Armstrong to write the questions and do at least 25 questions. And the first show I ever saw, they did 9 questions. And I went, that's not going to work. And they spent a lot of money on it, and it never really worked. No. I could look at Vicky Casper was my PA. I could look, if something was distasteful or too long, I could look at Vicky, and she called Jerry Shaw, the director, and she knew that was an edit. And then she would back time. And so we used to edit on air, and I got very good at it. I said, boy, that's lousy. That's really That's going to make that person look bad. So I'd look at Vicki, and I'd repeat the question, and so they had a clean edit on it. She would call, Pete's going to repeat the question, so they could cut that. They could back time it, yeah. We learned how to, hey, you got to remember, we did almost 6,000 shows. And I did them all with Jerry Shaw. Nobody talks about Jerry Shaw, or my announcer, Kenny Williams. Great announcer, and I had so much fun with Kenny. I never rehearsed the show. I just would show up at the studio, I'd read the questions, because phonetically I might look at hyperbole, and if you look at hyperbole and you haven't looked at it before, you might say hyperbole, or, so I'd look at hyperbole, and so I'd just look at the questions. And I could look and say, this is a straight line. I never knew who had the jokes, and whoever had the jokes never knew what the straight line was. That was the interesting part of it. I have a book out called Backstage with the Original Hollywood Squares, because so many people ask me, were they set up, so I wrote this book, not about my life, just about my almost 16 years of doing squares, and it explains all of that. And it's really interesting, because those are the questions. Did the stars know the question? I'd say no. They never knew the question. They knew an area of the question, but they never knew the question. They might get a joke, but they never knew what the straight line was. And I could look at Paul when I read a straight line, and he would give me that little grin. He just loved the straight line, because he had it. I'd say, as an example, they might set him up, say, Pete's going to ask you a show business question. The first question is going to be on show business. A good bluff, they wouldn't give you the answer. A good bluff might be, let's say Omar Bradley. Omar Bradley might be a good bluff, okay? That's all he got. And a good joke might be, and I won't do the joke, but it might be this. So I'd say, Paul, in World War II, who was known as Old Blood and Guts? And he'd say, oh, yeah, that was Barbara Stanwyck. But see, I didn't know the joke, he didn't know the straight line, and if he didn't know it was Patton, he had Omar Bradley, because you had to agree or disagree with the star. That was the whole gimmick that we had. That's how it worked. I would sit there, ask these questions, and scream. What a job. What a fun evening that was. Oh, that was simple. Because for the most part, they were just questions. They were legit questions. To the Karen Valentines and Abby Dalton, although Abby was awfully funny. And Karen was too at the time. And it's funny how Paul would love certain people. He loved the Lennon sisters. In fact, I'm going to be doing 3 concerts with the Lennon sisters coming up, yeah. And they're still wonderful. And they still look terrific. But anyway, we'd put 2 on his right, 2 on his left. And I would know who he liked or who he disliked just by his attitude. I won't mention names of people he disliked, but he loved Karen Valentine. And, had he been straight, that would have been the one he would have gone for, I'll tell you right now.
He and I agree on that. Room 222.
And she still looks great. Yeah. I just had when my book came out, I had a book signing. Abby Dalton looks like she may be aged a week and a half. Karen Valentine looks exactly the same. I mean, all the guys are older, but the girls look terrific. Nanette Fabre, who's now, she admits to it, I'm not telling you, she's like 83 or 84. She looks wonderful. And they all showed up for my book signing. Harvey Korman, and all my game show buddies, and it was really so much fun. I tell you who was a caterer of ours. It was Richard Simmons. He was a caterer, yeah. He used to work in a restaurant on Wilshire Boulevard. Charles Bragg, the artist, took me there one night, and he was the maitre d', and he flew. He didn't walk. He just flew around the place. Would fly, and he started a catering business with just salads, and he had a very clever name, and I can't remember it. But Richard Simmons, he was one of our caterers, but we would cater a dinner, and you got to remember, in NBC in those days, the young lady who's makeup, she's over there at NBC, she does Days of Our Lives. And there's the Tonight Show and maybe Entertainment Tonight and the news. When I was there was the Andy Williams shows, the Dean Martin show, there was Laugh-In, there was the Flip Wilson show, there was, it went on and on and on. So we'd have a dinner we'd do 3 shows, have dinner, and go back and do 2 shows. We did 5 shows a day. and everybody would come to the dinners. Dean Martin would be there, whoever was taping, and all the stars would bring their guests. We'd have like 150 people for luncheon or dinner, whatever it was. And those were so much fun. And unfortunately, not or fortunately, whatever, a lot of my stars would imbibe a little too much. So the last two shows were normally very, very funny, especially with Paul. True or false, birds fly. That's not too good, you know. Interesting questions make a show. And these guys, I can't think of anything off the top of my head. Or, oh, I'll think of one. Okay, let's say, I'll give you three names. I'll give you three names. I'll say, were these three guys Tarzans? Were they vice presidents? Or were they school, whatever, inventors? Now that's interesting. You heard three names, and were they and they were all Tarzans. And because there were some Tarzans that nobody, like Buster Crabbe was a Tarzan. I'm trying to think of the original Tarzan. He had varicose veins, which made me laugh. Elmo Lincoln. Elmo Lincoln, Buster Crabbe, and some other obscure name. Were they vice president? So that's an interesting question to me. And then we'd have Trek questions, like, now is the capital of Kentucky, is it pronounced Louisville or Louisville? I'll ask you, is it Louisville or Louisville?
Well, I say Louisville.
You'll say Louisville? No, it's Frankfurt. Those kinds of questions. They're cute and clever and tricky, and that's the kind of thing that good writers can do. I'm amazed it's taken this long for the game show cycle to come back. Of course, there's always been the Jeopardy and the Wheel of Fortune and the Bob Barker Show, Price is Right. But you got to remember, when I was doing Squares, there were like 5 game shows on NBC, 6 on ABC. You know, they were huge. And at night, there were all kinds of shows. I've noticed lately a resurgence of interest in the game show genre. Like Deal or No Deal is a huge hit. I know that. And The Millionaire is doing well, I guess. Then there's the syndicated shows like the old Dickie Dawson show. What the heck's the name of that?
Family Feud.
Family Feud. So those are still in syndication, and I think they're all doing very well. So I wouldn't be surprised to see game shows on daytime again. They're inexpensive, and there's an audience out there for them if it's the right show, I feel. I did a pilot called The Numbers Game, and he hosted it, and ABC didn't want him, and I insisted that he do it. And my show was lousy, but he was terrific, and ABC signed him for the other show. That's how he got it. You didn't have to be Paul Lynde. We asked you not to be Paul Lynde. We would take care of you if you were a comedian or comedienne. We would set you up with funny jokes and make you look as good as possible. Then the rest was up to you. But for the most part, the Robert Fullers and the Patrick Waynes and all the young leading men, those are the guys we look for also, because they just played the game. They played the game straight. They didn't try to be funny. And only maybe 3 people on a show. And you must remember, the 2 shows that were the most popular. Now, when I did Squares, there were 3 networks and maybe 2 affiliates, 2 independents. There were no cable. I used to get 52 shares. In the summers, we would go down to maybe a 32 share, and people would panic. 32 share. But our average was 40, 45 share. You know, 20. So that and The Tonight Show were the 2 shows where you could plug a movie, a record, or a book, or whatever. So that was the one that everybody tried to get on to plug something. And I made sure that if you had a book or you had a record or a film, I made sure you got plugged. Because I know how that is, because I've been on shows where I've tried to plug something and they just kind of run over it, you know, and you go, doggone it. So if you had a book or a record or a film or whatever, I made sure that it was bang. Oh yeah, I would get calls, you know, from you, hey, Pete, I'm coming to California. I want to do Squares. And these are stars. And I would say, have your people call Mary Markham, because I have nothing to do with the show, which was right. I had nothing to do with the show. It took me 2 years to get one of my best friends on the show. 2 years. And here is a comic that is brilliant. And once he did the show, he never left. Cliff Arquette was sick. And I said, let's get George Gobel. They went. It took me 2 years to get him. He was like my brother. And I knew he would be a smash. I maybe 3 people, and all the years I did Squares, I said, hey, could you, with my sister, George Gobel, and my darling closest friend of my whole life today, Tom Poston. Tom moved to California. And I said, I think we could use Tom Poston on the show. They did that like that. But for some reason, Gobel, it took me 2 years to get it. And by the way, when they called me and said, hey, Gobel's going to do the show. I ran to the Tail of the Cock, which is a restaurant we used to hang out in. And he was at the bar with Packy, his writer. And I said, George, you're going to do the show next week? He said, I'm not going to do your show. I'd be awful. I said, I didn't tell him I'd been trying for 2 years. I said, George, just shut up. You're going to do the show, all right? He said, well, okay. And what can I tell you? He was my favorite. He was the new hit, and I knew he would be. He was brilliant. George Gobel, wow. It took me a long time to get Joanne on, my own sister. I said, guys, you got to book my sister. We've never worked together. And then I said to Joanne, you got to do this. And she was very shy. She said, no, I said, you're going to do the show. And she came on. She had all my life I was known as, before I was an entity of sorts, I was known as Joanne Drew's brother, or her husband, Dick Hames's brother-in-law, right? So she came on with a T-shirt that said, Peter Marshall's sister. She was something. Groucho Marx wasn't very good on the show. One of my close, I won't mention his name because he's a brilliant comic, wasn't good on the show. You got to remember, well, I'll give you an example. He's no longer with us. Henny Youngman, very funny man. And we're doing the show in Vegas at the Riviera Hotel. And Gobel always dressed with me. And he had some problems with his legs. Henny did. So I said, well, dress with George and myself. I had the dressing room downstairs. And so I said, Henny, I'm so excited you're on the show. Now, here's the way the show works. I'll ask you a question, and if you have a joke, do it, and then get to the answer, okay? Because 20 seconds, 25 seconds, any longer is no good, okay? He says, you got it. First question was, do birds fly? He said, these 2 guys, they go bear hunting. They come to a sign that says bear left, so they went home. And I said, Henny, do birds fly? He said, there was this girl in Cleveland, and and Gobel fell off his chair. And I said, we got to stop tape, guys, because he didn't get it. And Groucho didn't get it. A lot of people didn't work on the show. Paul Lynde was brilliant because, hey, Paul, how many men on a hockey team? About half. Bang, that's it. There you go. Now move on. You know, that's the show. You can't do a long monologue.
And
Sorry, I just
yeah, I can just see Paul sitting there doing it.
You know, the most famous joke of all was the first joke that Paul ever did. And it was, say, Paul, why do motorcyclists wear leather? And he said, well, because chiffon wrinkles. Now, that's got to scream. That's Bill Armstrong. That's his joke. And he said, yeah, I think I'll write some stuff for Paul. Incidentally, Paul came up with a lot of his own stuff. And even though it was written for the most part, it's the way he delivered it. And he was brilliant. He was just about as good as you can get. And he had been around forever. He had been on the Dean Martin show. He was on the original Perry Como show. He was on Bewitched. But he wasn't, but put him on Squares, and he hated the fact that he became a star from Hollywood Squares. But, you know, he even left the show for a year and came back, and yeah, I missed him. He made me laugh, I'll tell you. Gene and I, when I was a page boy, his brother Jim Rabessa, his name was Rabessa, his mine is Lecoq. I worked with Jim, but Gene had been a page boy at NBC and radio too. Then he went over to WNEW and they did a show called Rayburn and Finch. It was a very popular radio show. And we looked a little alike. We were not a dissimilar look. And I was in New York. I had had a show called Two of the Most on ABC. And the show was canceled. I had my 4 kids back there, my wife, and I got to get back to California. And I ran into Gene. He said, I'm doing a Pontiac commercial. And he said, they need a twin. Would you like to do it? I said, yeah, I got to get my kids and everybody back to California. And I made myself like $2,800. Now we're talking about, 53, 54? That's good money, you know? And they gave me a little different nose, a different hairline, and we did look like twins. And we were friends. We've known each other. And in fact, the last time I saw him, he had lost his wife, and he was not ill. He was very ill, rather, and he was not happy, and quite ill. And I took him out to dinner with Tom Poston and my wife, Laurie. And he was just so sad, and he was gone shortly after that. Yeah, but he was a great MC, great game show host. Watch the old Match Game. Terrific. Oh gosh, I've tried to analyze it. I can't really give you a definitive answer. I think we all like to see people do well. I think we like to see competition. That's why football, baseball, whatever. And you have two contestants, four contestants, and you all of a sudden you like one, you don't like the other. You're rooting for one, not the other. It's like the American Idol. You know, we all have our favorite, and so we're interested in those people. And I think that's part of it. I think we like to say, boy, I wish I could get on that show. Gosh, that guy just won a car, you know. There's so many things involved in why game shows work. I can't really analyze it, but and as I said, I don't watch many game shows. But when I do watch a game, because I miss great game shows. I miss Password, those kind. You don't say. But when I would watch game shows, I would root for one or the other. Don't you? Yeah, sure. That's human nature, yeah. Well, I would go there, as I said, would go over the questions, then I'd look to see who's on the show. And I was never too good about analyzing the show. I would see all these people. I said, this has got to be really a great show. And it was so-so. Some nights I'd look at the 9 stars were, you know, and that went through the roof because there was a party atmosphere. And as I mentioned earlier, a familial thing, because Cliff Arquette, Charlie Weaver, Wally Cox, who I've known, I knew Cliff Arquette, Charlie Weaver, since I was 18. I went to PS 165 in New York. Wally Cox was a year ahead of me. George Gobel, we go back when we were first starting. You know, Rosemarie I've known all my life. Vincent Price, when I was under contract as a kid at Fox, I knew him when I was 17 years old. So these people I knew. I knew these people, and we were friends. And so we got together once a week to do 5 shows, make a few bucks, and have a lot of laughs. And that's what we did. That was really, I tell you, the Match Game had that too. You had your regulars and your semi-regulars. So we had basically 5 people who were regulars, and then four people who were pluggies, who had a new picture or a new book or a new record or something on the show. Or a new sitcom, yeah. Chuck Woolery, Wheel of Fortune. I'm trying to think of the name of the guy that was running NBC in LA. I can't think of his name. But he came to me and he said, take a look at Chuck Woolery. See if you can help him. He's having problems. He can't remember, he can't do this. I said, okay. So I looked at Chuck Woolery. Chuck made mistakes, but he was darling. And I said, if you touch Chuck Woolery, you're nuts. Let him fumble, let him stumble, let him go, because he's real. And he's handsome as could be, and he's having a good time. Don't mess with this guy. Don't make him slick. There are a lot of MCs that were slick. In fact, they started editing me because I would make mistakes. And I would say, don't edit me unless I say, you know, something profane. But if I goof, leave it in. You dehumanize the person. I won't mention names, but there were some guys that were so slick I couldn't stand to watch. And they were that smooth MC guy, you know. Hey, go out and have some fun and be real. And Chuck was real, and they never touched him. And you got to remember, he was the star of that show long before what's-his-face came in, you know. Do you know what happened there? I'm sure Chuck told you the story, the Wheel of Fortune? Well, they were canceled on daytime. They canceled, and that's when Fred Silverman was at NBC. and he canceled this and that. And then Letterman, they'd cancel Squares because see, Fred Silverman turned it down to CBS originally, so we always hated the show. So he kept moving us, so the ratings kept going up, so he just canceled us. And he put on David Letterman daytime. And I said to Jay Michaels, who was the vice president, I said, have you ever heard of a 9 share? I said, Letterman is so hip for daytime. You'll get a one. They laughed at me. He got a 9 share. So it was an hour and a half of disaster. He belongs where he is, nighttime, you know. So they cut a half hour. So they cut all these. They got rid of Wheel of Fortune. At the wrap party, they looked at the schedule. Fred Silverman realized that he had cut too many shows. They were lacking a half hour. So they ran down to Merv Griffin and they renewed the show. And so at that time, Chuck Woolery, now this is the story, you'll have to ask Chuck, but the story that I get, and I think it's true, asked for a raise, deservedly so. He'd been on a lot of years. And Merv said no. And so he got the weatherman, who's, what the heck's his name?
Sajak.
Yeah, so he got the weatherman, Pat Sajak, and made him the host. And so they brought it back on. It was never a hit on daytime. It was an inexpensive show that did okay. It was never a hit. Jeopardy was a hit. Wheel of Fortune was okay. It wasn't Squares. It wasn't You Don't Say It. It wasn't any of those other shows. But it did okay, and it was inexpensive. Then they put it nighttime, and it went through the roof. Go figure that. Merv Griffin, he knows. He's the smartest guy around. He's amazing. And Pat Sajak went from the weatherman to a multimillionaire. Dan Rowan. I gave Dan Rowan, he was selling cars, and Dick Martin was a bartender. And they didn't know each other. And Tommy knew them both, and I knew Dick. I didn't know Dan. And we had a party one night, and Dan and Dick met, and they wanted to be in show business. And so Tommy thought it would be a great idea if we wrote material for them and got them into show business. And I said, I don't think that's a great idea. They're both, you know, Dick was a bar. He wasn't married, but Dan had he had a family, and I didn't think, you know, but we wrote this material for them, and they did well. They went out there and they did very, very well. Winchell fell in love with them down in Florida, and they were about ready to break up. And Winchell said, this great new comedy team, Rowan and Martin. And they became these big, big, big stars. Before Laugh-In, Dan tried out as the host for the Hollywood Squares. I didn't know this. They had auditioned a lot of people. I did not know that. And when I auditioned, they asked me to do a run-through. And I had just done a show in New York. I'm going to go back and do another Broadway show. So I wasn't really that interested in doing the Hollywood Squares, to be frank with you. It's all in this book I wrote. And so they said, well, if you're not going to do it, Dan Rowan's going to do it. Now let me go back a little. Dan and I had a falling out. I did not like Dan Rowan. And there are many reasons. The main reason being when Tommy was dying at the Motion Picture Home, I called everybody and I said, would you go out and spend some time with Tommy Noonan I'm speaking of, and Dick sent money. Dick Martin is wonderful. Dan never called, never went out, and Tommy was there for 8 months before he passed. And I never forgave Dan. So when I said, Dan Rowan, you'll use Dan Rowan? I said, I'll do the show. It was only 13 weeks. I could always go back and do another show. I called Abe Burrows, who wanted me for a breakfast at Tiffany's. I said, can I do 13 weeks? He said, we're not ready for the show for 6 months. Don't worry about it. So it's only 13 weeks, and I could screw a friend, you know? And so that's what I did. That's why I did the Hollywood Squares, to screw Dan Rowan. And it was good for Dan, because incidentally, I asked Dick Martin, did you know that Dan Rowan auditioned for Hollywood Squares? He said, no. I said, figures.
Well, in a strange way, I guess.
But it worked out for Dan, it worked out for me. Strange, huh?
Yeah.
You turn left or you turn right, it's going to change your life. I did the Lucy show. I played her brother-in-law with Janet Waldo, a very famous radio actress, television actress. And do you really want me to go into this thing? Oh, I had a miserable time. I was not happy doing the Lucy show because the Cuban crisis was on. I have 4 kids. I'm trying to figure out where can I hide my 4 children. I'll take them to Wrightwood. There's no way they could attack us at Wrightwood. No, I'll take them down to the desert. Now they're worried about the Lucy show, which I understand. But they were on my case about a word called fatui, about a fatui and a thing. And she said, and Lucy was not very nice to me. And she's hard to work for, very hard to work for. Socially, lovely, but once you, hard. And so I must say, I did the show, and there was a knock on the door, and she said, "You were wonderful." I said, "Thank you, Miss Ball." They offered me about 8 more shows as her brother-in-law. It was going to be a running character. And I said, "No." I said, "I can't do that. I can't work with her." Many years later, I get a call. She's doing a movie with, it's called Happy Anniversary and Goodbye, and they want you to play a wonderful role. And I said, "No, I can't do that. I can't work with Miss Ball." They said, now Gary Morton was her husband and an old buddy of mine. He called me, he said, "What are you, crazy? Everybody wants this part." I said, "I can't work with your wife." He said, "All your scenes are with Art Carney." I said, "Art Carney? I'll do it for scale." You know, are you kidding? I did it. And Nanette Fabre was also in it. And I said, "Have you ever worked with Lucille Ball?" They said, "No, we're just so excited." I said, "You'll both quit. You'll both want to quit." First read through, she gets on Art Carney. Now, Art Carney is the greatest sketch comic for me, maybe the top 3 that ever lived. She said, "That's a terrible reading. Have you ever done?" And he thought she was kidding, and he started to laugh. He realized that she was serious, and he quit. And I grabbed him. I said, "You can't do this to me. This is why I'm doing this show." And he stayed. And socially, she was great to work with. Boy, was she tough. That's my Lucille Ball story. I don't know if they ever, it was a TV movie, a very funny movie. Nanette was lovely. And, oh, by the way, in that movie, there was a guy that played a masseur. First thing he ever did, I think. And I have it on tape. I have the show on tape. Gary gave me the tape. And when I do public appearances, I don't show him myself. I said, "This is the guy's first appearance. He plays a masseur. It comes through as Arnold Schwarzenegger playing masseur." I think that was his first job in film. John Wayne. John Wayne, I have a letter. One of my prized possessions is a letter I received from John Wayne, threatening my life. John Wayne is going to beat me up. He says, "If I ever pass you on the street, run, because I'm going to smash your face in." It all started with a question. According to Rona Barrett, what do John Wayne's children call him? And the answer was "Sir." Now, I didn't write the question. I didn't say that John Wayne did this. According to Rona Barrett. Well, I get this scathing letter from John Wayne threatening my life, which I have framed. It's in the book, by the way, the book I wrote. And if you read when people come to the house, they read the letter, they scream. I wanted to go on the Tonight Show and say, "Well, John, the Duke's after me," and read the letter. What do I do? The Duke is after me. And Patrick, who's a friend, Patrick Wayne, his son, said, "Don't, Pete." He said, "Dad's not doing well, you know." He said, he screamed at me. I came in with long hair. I just did a Western. He called me a hippie and threw me out of the house. So, but I do have this letter, which I just love. Rosemarie, I've known a long, long time. Do you know that Rosemarie was probably the biggest star on radio at one time? She was as big as Shirley Temple. Shirley Temple in movies, Rosemarie in vaudeville, and the radio. Baby Rosemarie. She was this big. She was as big as you could get. They had dolls. They did things. I mean, she was as big as... Now, another thing you don't know about Rosemarie, when Bugsy Siegel opened the Flamingo Hotel, you know who the first headliner was? That's how big she was. Rosemarie. Rosemarie's career, she wrote a book. I don't know how the book did, but it's a brilliant book. It's called, I think it's called Send Me the Roses or something like that. And what's Scarface? What's his name? Al Capone. Al Capone adored her. And she did parties for Al Capone for the time she was this big to this big to this big. And her life story, somebody should do a film of. And when we did Hollywood Squares, and she was one of the one of the stars, and she was a regular. She did, you know, she was on the show for almost 16 years. I was thrilled because she's not only my friend, but she's charming and she's funny, and she's one of the reasons Squares did as well as it did. That's my Rosemarie story. I love her.